Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1318. Aleph Shin Yud Ches. And the Rebbe Rashab have now established two ways of sweetening the severities. It's called Hamtokes Hagvuras. Now, both ways we've now established are happening through Chesed. So, because that's the prominent, that's the, he said, that's the Yesod B'Teira. He used the words, Kol HaTeira Nivna Al Yesod Zeh. The entire Torah is built on the Yesod of Chesed, sweetening Gevurah. Lahamtik Hadin Dikava Smel B'Chesed. So based on that, especially B'Zman Hazeh, today, not L'Asad Lovei, not in the future, so both methods are happening through Chesed. The difference is, one is like the sweetening of waters. You bring enough sweet water, so it overrides and nullifies the bitter waters. So the bitter waters have not been transformed, only their hispashtus, only their expression. Like in the case of the animal soul, its expression has been subdued or tamed or even nullified. But it hasn't been fundamentally transformed by etzem mahusei, like he says. Whereas the second form of sweetening, also through chesed, actually transforms that the gevurah itself, or the bitterness itself, the nefesh habamis itself is transformed. The ra is nepach l'teiv, like he said in the previous page, where the passion of the undesirable, of the inappropriate or negative desire, burning like fire, has been transformed now to a burning fire for love of God. But it also happens through chesed. Chesed is the catalyst that drives this. The question is only how deep it affects. The words he used was, the first approach is more, he doesn't say the word kamus, but he said, ribuya miyut, that enough, when there's enough abundance of chesed, it will nullify and neutralize, you can say. It's another good word. Neutralize the gevurah, the bitterness or the darkness. And the second approach, he says, because chesed has something, but he said that not its abundance. The words he used, the exact words, was that the very quality and something about chesed, about love, that has a power to transform the gevurah, not just to neutralize it. And he called that Shem Ba L'mayla M'Shem Ba. That's Ma, that's higher than Shem Ban. Yeah, Tagberes Achsadim. And then he added one more thing, that L'Asad Lovei, Gevurah, this is all Chesed dominating over Gevurah. The question is to what extent it affects it. Which in the Avodah, that would mean that the divine soul is dominating over the animal soul. The question is how much? In a tzaddik gomer, it completely eliminates it and transforms it. In a tzaddik sheina gomer, something remains, as we said, some speck that remains that he also ultimately conquers. In a beinani, there's no fundamental muhus change. It's only a matter of control, like the first day of the Hamtokah, or at least part of it would be like that. And L'Asad Lovei, something new happens. The Gevurah itself, which God also created, remember, it itself will have a Maila over Chsadim, and the Hamtokes HaGevuras will be on its own. When its own doesn't mean just that it will be transformed, but not even Chesed will not be the catalyst that did it. Gevurah itself will have something that connects it to the divine. And the Me'ein Zeh, he said a similar a semblance of this we have today in tshuva, how tshuva transforms ra. Now, clearly we know that tshuva could also be seen in like the second way, which is what? That the chesed transforms, the love for God transforms also the ra by Baal tshuva. But clearly there's a deeper level of tshuva where the ra itself is transformed, which we're going to learn, Kamoshi is boy. I already hinted to it earlier when he said that the transformation is Sabche Chashech Nehera by Tzadikim Gemurim and by Balei Tshuva Amitim. He used the word amitim. I'm reading on page 1315. But he also said kamoishi is bar. So all this is being reserved for later discussion. But at least we know that this idea is on the table, and we'll learn a lot more about it. So if you want clarification, you have to look later. We haven't learned it yet. What I want to do before we continue on, I want to give a little background. Remember, Ayin Beis, like all Chassidus, doesn't begin from the beginning. It assumes that we learned things before, and there's certain basic principles in place. So when you immerse yourself in any new subject in Ayin Beis, there are always certain previous concepts that need to be clarified. So I felt I want to go back a moment and just explain the idea of Gevurah and Chesed and understand a bit what he means by Zman Hazeh, L'Asad Laveh. I alluded to it, I hinted to it a bit yesterday, but I think it deserves a little more a fundamental background. So let me explain. It all begins with the fact that Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu, Liyasleis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, that God had a desire to have a dira, a home B'Tachtenim. We know that the Alter Rebbe says, a Nesava, the word Nesava is the word from Medrash, that if a Taivan is stuck in Kash, you ask, why did he desire? There is no why. It's higher than the level of why, because why is already a world of logic and seichel, which actually was created because Nesava Kadosh Baruch, because he desired that dira b'tachtenim in a world like ours. Therefore, he created seichel. So to say that seichel will determine the Nesava is the other way around. The Nesava determines the seichel. So if a taivan is stuck in kasha, just to establish that. Just 1 second, I want to just adjust something. 1 second. Okay. Now, once you have that Nesava, because Baruch Aliyas plays Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, that begins a whole process. I'll just add one more thing about the Taiva thing. If it were to be Al Pi Seichel, then you would have to say that God is driven by Seichel. Just giving another point. And Seichel is a creation of God's. And God is not confined or defined by intelligence. Just like he's not defined by any particular identity. We say Nesava, not because God is defined by a Taiva either, it's just the best language we have, humans have, that God gave us some type of language to understand something that's beyond structure. So the truth is, even Nesava, the way we have a Taiva, and God has a Taiva is not the same thing. But I don't want to go into that. It's not so relevant to our conversation. I'm just mentioning it because it's important that it all begins from that highest level of Atzmus. Now, once that is there, an entire process begins, all driven, of course, by God. And the process we've discussed a number of times is that God says, Dir b'tachtenim literally means that there has to be a structure called tachten. And the tachtenim, the way we see it today. And that compels, not God, but it compels this process to create tachtenim and to do that in a logical way. And God does want it to be logical because he wants tachtenim. We are creatures of seichel to understand, appreciate the process, and also retrace the steps, as I explained many times. In order for us to have a dira, remember, it's not just nesava tachtenim, that he desired tachtenim. He wanted a dira b'tachtenim, which immediately says you need two things here. You need godliness to feel comfortable, like in a home, in a place which is completely hostile to him, because it conceals his presence. That's what tachtenim means, as the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 36. So this really, dir b'tachtenim, compels two statements, two realities, two tracks. One is to create tachtenim, and that will need concealment, simsum, helam, gevurah, ultimately. And the second is dir b'tachtenim. That means that which says that it has to have gilui, because dir b'tachtenim means a revealed home. Not that God is concealed in tachtenim, that he lives here or dwells in this world in a way that's completely apparent and obvious. So you need really two opposites. So they're called the koiche lahoyer, koiche yecholte lahoyer, cholte sheloi lahoyer. Now God, of course, has the capacity to do anything. So essentially two tracks come into play. One is called oir, which is gilui, expression, consciousness, awareness. And the second is the power of helam, the power to conceal, the power not to be revealed and present. Though he's there, but it's in a state of concealment. Now, in the highest levels, it doesn't yet have the Eisi. We can't even talk about words like Oir and Tzimtzum. What we talk about is the Yecholte, God's capacity to do so. But at some point, we do talk about Eir and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, as we've elaborated upon, and all the levels that it goes through. But we also talk about the Helam Ha'atzmi, the fundamental concealment that God is beyond Gili. And that precedes Oir, because it's a higher state, as we discussed. These two tracks will ultimately evolve. In Basi Legani, he uses the words Lamai Lamai Adein Ketz, Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis. So Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis is Gili, going down more and more and more. And Lamai Lamai Adein Ketz is Helam Acher Helam. I believe that's what he says there. But sometimes it's interpreted the other way around. Lamai Adein Ketz is Helam Acher Helam. And Lamata and Mailad and Kates is Giluyim, and Lamata Mato meaning one concealment after another concealment. In Bastaligani, I'm now confused which one it is, but regardless, they're both legitimate interpretations. In context of what we're discussing, it doesn't really matter, because what we're talking about are these two tracks. That ultimately, the Eir Ein Sof, which is so dominant as divine consciousness before the Tzimtzum, which really is essentially chasadim, as we'll soon discuss. It's the root of a flow of revelation. That's what chesed is in its essence, love. On the other hand, the tzimtzum addition, which will conceal that oir in the different ways it conceals it, in order to allow for tachtenim to emerge, which really begins with an independent consciousness to emerge. And that too will go through many tzimtzumim, the kav, level after level after level, till it finally comes in Tachtenim, from after the world of Atzilus, the Klolus, and Bria, and Yitzira, Asiya, and then in the Pratis, Ak, Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, and Abiyah, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, a microcosm, that ultimately will come down to Tachtenim. So what we have is the Oyer, is the Gili, the divine being revealed, the Tzimtzum is the concealment, and they work hand in hand. The Tzimtzum conceals, the Kav reveals, but only in a measure now. It's only a Kav Hamida. It's very measured in order to be tailored to the containers. Eiris and Kalim is another way of saying Gili and Helam. And all of it, in other terms, is Chesed and Gevurah. So when you talk about it in its original states, in its root, Chesed and Gevurah are simply two expressions of Elikus. One is through revealing and one is through concealing. In the words of, he says in Shayichet V'Amunah, when he says Tzimtzum is Hein Hein Gvuresav, it's simply God's Gvuras. The thing is, from the perspective of the viewer or the recipient, Gvura is a concealed, so you don't see the divine in it. You have to contemplate on that. When it comes to Chesed, Oyer, we see. So there's a difference in our experience of it, but both of them are divine tracks. So in its root, both Chesed and Gevurah, both Oyer and Helam, Gili and Helam, are two divine elements. But here's the big caveat. To create Tachtenim, you need concealment, because if not, we'll be completely subsumed and absorbed in the divine consciousness. We need independent consciousness. That's the whole purpose of Tzimtzum, of Gevurah. But like in the example of the Magid, that the father who hides from the child, the concealment can also deceive us into thinking that God is not present. God forbid. And then Gevurah starts taking on a whole different context. Because when it's misunderstood or misused, it could also allow for the injustices and for every crime and every transgression, even to the worst possible severities of Gevurah. So it originates in the concealment. But it doesn't mean concealment itself has a purpose, like we learned at length in volume 2. The whole purpose of the concealment, like the teacher concealing his brilliance, is also an expression of love. It's in order to bring the chesed, the flow of the teacher's ideas to the student in a way the student can contain it. But if the student misunderstands the teacher's concealment and even the teacher's silence, that leads that the student says, you know what, maybe my teacher has abandoned me. So maybe God, like we say, im yesh alikim, what's the lashon there? Im yesh alikim b'kirbenu imoyin. where the Jews start saying, is God really with us? Or maybe not. On the simple interpretation of it. So we can begin to misunderstand the concealment. And as this concealment becomes more and more misunderstood, you start it can become a life of its own, which is essentially the free will, which the whole purpose of it, the concealment, was for us to choose independently, but we can also choose the other way. So basically, the concealment allows for the possibility for wandering away from the reservation, as Adam and Chava did when they ate from the tree of knowledge, and as the generations afterwards did. And what happened now is a new Gevurah has taken on a whole new reality. It's now become not just Gevurah, Hein Gvuresav, the concealment of the divine. It's been given a life of its own through our, in a way, validating it not as a concealment in order to reveal, but as a concealment as an end in itself, to the point that we can convince ourselves that the reality that we are tachtenim is more real than godliness, meaning that a state where we are independent consciousness, elikus, is bipshitus and elam is, elikus is bischachus and elam is bipshitus. Existence is a given. And the world and godliness is a novelty. Like he said, when he began this discussion about how the neshama comes down below in order to change that. But what is the reality? The reality is a dark world, even though godliness is in it. So we learned at length when he started this discussion here on page 1307, that the purpose of human beings coming below is to radiate and illuminate a darkness, a cheshach de'elim, which is a cheshach kafla mechupla, a double and quadruple darkness, where you only see the physical reality. In truth, is God's symptom that it is. Like he explains in Shiur, it's God's power to conceal. But we may not know that. Definitely not in our feelings, even if we understand it with our seichel. So now Gevurah has become a machine of a force of its own. So if Gevurah was only a divine expression of godly concealment, then that would be beautiful, but it's not the case because of the need to have a independent consciousness. So it's like what we say about day 2. Day 1 is Chesed, Sunday, and that's when God created Oyer. Chesed and Oyer are the same thing. Vahi Oyer, V'yimar Elikim, V'yikra Elikim, L'Oyer Yom. That's Chesed. On day 2, God separated the higher from the lower, the higher waters and the lower waters. He created separation. He created diversity. That's called Gevurah. Day 2, Chesed is day 1. Day 2 is Gevurah. Gevurah separates. It distinguishes. And that's why it doesn't say Kitayv on day 2. Why? Because Machlekes, diversity, which is the potential for conflict and divisiveness, was created on day 2. You can't call it revealed good. Day 3, the creation of vegetation and birth and regeneration and perpetuation of a species, that's day 3. That's Tiferes. Tiferes is Huchbal by Kitayv. You have a Toiv for day 3, but it also makes shalom between day 1 and day 2. And it shows that day 2, the purpose of the tzimtzum of day 2 and the separation was not separation in order for separation. It was separation in order to create a dir b'tachtenim, basically a diversity in order to create harmony within diversity. So that's why it says Kitayv in day 3. Similar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan is also considered Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes. Nisan is a Gili Chesed, Malmayla, Niglalem, Melech Malchem Lochem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'Golam, that God revealed himself and redeemed us. Iyar is our work from below up in the counting of the Omer, and Tiferes, Zu Matan Torah, Sivan, Matan Torah brings together both, and it reveals the deeper purpose, even in the concealment of Gevurah. Okay. So once Gevurah has been misunderstood or misdirected, now you can't just live in a world where you say, okay, there's 2 tracks of the divine, Chesed and Gevurah. So what do? What's the solution? If somebody, let's talk psychologically speaking, it's a misunderstood and the concealment, and then they went off on their own, and they're now become addicted to something, what do? You can't rely and say, by the way, the Gevurah that you misunderstood was not a concealment for you to go off and do whatever you want. It was only matter to bring out your deeper strengths to connect to the divine. But once there's a sin, and a sin, Aveda, means a displacement, a disalignment, how do you correct this misalignment? So the Eibishter made, and this is what he says here, that the whole binyan yesod of Torah is to sweeten the Gevurah. God, thank God, gave us also chesed. In other words, if we were just left at our own accord, you could say a person, once he sins and goes off course, there's no hope for him. No, there's still chesed in existence. God did not create a total concealment. There is the nefesh alekis. Like he said earlier, the nefesh alekis brings oir into the picture. Bottom line is this existence, as much as it's divine is concealed, there's also, it's not airtight, where there's no kav. The kav is radiating, at least a reflection. Somewhere there is a divine energy. There are sparks. Yes, they're concealed. They're being held hostage. It's not just shalosh klippos atmeis. We also have klippos nega, which is called the bright or the radiant klippa. So in other words, with work, you could discover light. Basically, we're not just left dealing with Gevurah and trying to figure out how to reconnect and reclaim the connection of Gevurah to God's to the source in the Helam Ha'atzmi and the Tzimtzum from God's power to conceal. So Chesed becomes our redeeming element. In different words, we're not just products of our bodies and our animal souls. We also have a neshama. And Ner Hashem nishmas adam. The neshama is compared to a flame. So we have within us a radiating, a burning light. Yes, we need to fan the flames. We need to contemplate, and we need to bring it into emotions like we discussed, or else it will remain dormant. But it's not an airtight reality where just Gevurah dominates. So even though he says in Tanya clearly, and he cited it here before, that Elam Hazeh Agashmi V'Achumri is a world where the Shoyim Gevrim by. The words of the Alter Rebbe is that Kol Maisa Elam, all the affairs of this world are Royim V'Koshim, are evil and difficult and harsh. And it says, Amole Klippas V'Sitra Achra. It's filled with Klippa and Sitra Achra, with opposite energy that conceals the divine, to the point that the Shoyim Gevrim by. This words, the exact words he quoted earlier, I believe was on top of, we spoke about, let me just, right here, the top of page 13, 413. And he said the words, the bottom of page 1312, top of 1313. So it's true. It's a world where Gevurah dominates, and that's why you see, indeed, that there's a lot of harshness in this world, cruelty. Look what people have done to people throughout history, both on a collective level and individual level. So Gevurahs dominate here very powerfully. What's Gevurah? The Gevurah that's rooted in the Tzimtzum Arishin, but now it's taken on a whole life of its own. So when you say, for example, Hitler, Yamach Shemayim, and the Nazis massacred Jews, it's rooted, it was only made possible because there was a concealment. If godliness was not concealed, there's no possibility for a human being to even do something like that. There's no possibility for a person in general to do anything on his own. But because God concealed in order to create space and room for independent consciousness, when that evolves, like we learned many times, tzimtzumim achet tzimtzumim, and we're talking about thousands of evolutions, until it comes to a point where you could literally have somebody, like he says in Perek Lamed Vav and Tanya, that says, Ani v'afsied, I and nothing else. There is no God. There's only me. It doesn't begin with that. It begins with a small concealment or a big concealment. And then as it continues, it can turn into the worst possible Gevurahs koshes, as he called it earlier, very harsh severities of the worst type, literally. We're talking about the worst possible. Every trauma, every evil perpetrated, every form of abuse, every pain, every suffering, all rooted in that Helam. But the Helam is now, as I said, has a life of its own, Kav Yachal. And in a tragic way, when we give credence and we think the Helam is a power of its own, we actually feed it. Because the Helam, all it is really a means to Gili. And when you see it and worship it as an end in itself, that gives it more power. And it's really going against its very real nature, because its nature is only to be a means and to be dispelled and eliminated. A Helam b'shul Gili. But when you value something that is only, it's like the klippa. You start worshiping the potato peel or the eggshell or an orange peel, and forget there's a fruit inside, that's the total distortion. Chassidus sometimes brings that the Avodah Zarah Baal Pa'ir, where they worship literally waste, human waste. Waste is only a byproduct. And you start worshiping it, that's like the worst possible clip because what you're doing is you're worshiping something that the whole point of it is only to be a means to something else. But let's go back to where I am here. So we are also given chesed to sweeten these gevurahs. And the chesed comes from the neshama, from Oir, from Torah Oir. What does it say? That the Eibishter created Yetzer Hara, but then he created Torah Tavlin. That Torah should be like a spice that tames, that neutralizes the Yetzer Hara. So Torah is also, Torah is chesed, Torah is Torah Oir. All of that is basically gifts that God gave us in this world to bring back light into a dark world. Or in other words, to bring chesed into a world of gevurah, like we learned yesterday, that's the yisod. Kol ha-Torah is nivna on this yisod. Lahamtik hadin the kava smell, b'chesed the kava yamin. What's that? Let me finish this whole thing. I want to give the whole picture so everybody gets it, and then I'll stop for questions. Lichlola smola b'yamina. Miyamina eish das lomei. The yamin dominates. Yamin Hashem remem, yamin Hashem eisachayil. And all these expressions. Kol inyan hatikun. B'tagberes achsodim the shema al b'chinas hagvuras the shem ban. So that is the approach. In different words, I'll just use it in the context of the creation of Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. So Adam and Chava were created, Zocher and Nekeva, male and female, one androgynous creature. They were like one entity, two faces of one entity. Then God separates, and B'Tselem Elokim, in the divine image, God separates them. Exactly the same idea. The Nesira, which is the separation, is the Tzimtzum, is Gevurah. When they were one, that's Chesed. Gevurah is to separate them with the goal, like Dira B'Tachtenim, that two separate entities who are now strangers should find each other and reunite and become back to Tselem Elokim that they were originally in. And then it's not just going back to step one. A new type of yichud is created, a yichud pnimi, a yichud ponim al ponim. Whereas when they began, it was back to back, as we learned as well. So the very concept of relationships and soulmates reflects in microcosm this whole theme. The idea of two individuals, which is diversity. Now they could go into conflict and war even with each other because they're different, and we see this unfortunately happen. Or they learn to love each other and reconnect to the original oneness that they had with the Tselem Elokim, the divine image in which they were created. Now comes the next step, the Chet Eitzadas. Had Adam and Chava not eaten from the tree, then we would have had, basically the Geula would have come. Everything would have been accomplished. You would have the Gilui of Oir and Chesed. You'd have the Gevurah of the Tzimtzum. You'd have the union of Teferes that comes after the separation, and everything is good. But the Helam of the Miyut HaLavona, the diminishment of the moon, which is rooted in the Shviras HaKelim and the shattering of the containers of Toyu, which is rooted in the Tzimtzum Arishan. As this is all explained in a beautiful mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Al Kein Yemro HaMeshlim, Tofreis Tzadik Aleph. So what happened is now, Adam and Chava, they're not out of the woods yet. God tells them, here's the tree you should eat, the trees you should eat from, and from this tree you shall not eat. The Eitz Hadas Tev Ra, Tev and Ra. Who made a Tev and Ra? The Gevurah created two paths. But it's not actual evil yet. It's only God says, do this and don't do that. As long as you don't do it, like Eloisa said, la'avda or l'shamra. To work, la'avda is the ramach mitzvah sesa, the positive mitzvahs. L'shamra means protect and don't do the things I'm telling you not to do. Then it's all good. It's a perfect world. You have chesed and gevurah, both kedusha. Eloisa says also mitzvah, but only when you don't do it. So them telling them not to do it, basically God gave them the two choices, the two paths. However, the story with the Nochash, without going into all the details, they were tempted and they transgressed. They basically misunderstood, or however you want to explain it, there are different explanations, and they did eat from what they should not eat, at least not at that time. It says if they had waited 3 hours till Shabbos, they would have made Kiddush on the wine according to the opinion that it was a grapevine, the Eitz Hadas. But regardless, they ate from it. And as we all know, Basar Legani, the Medrash Shir Hashirim, the divine Shechina that was betachtenim, Legani, Legnuni, Legani Ksiv, Legnuni v'lei Legan, which means my bridal chamber, where God was one with existence, the godliness was revealed, that became concealed. And that was the first move where Gevurah went away from a Gevurah of Kedusha, and now became a concealment that was not purely godly energy. It was as a result of the mistake or the sin or the transgression or the misalignment and dissonance of Adam and Chava. And that begins the story that we talk about, where Gevurah has become a force. And if it continues as it did, unfortunately, generation after generation, the Gevurahs and the concealment became deeper. The second Rakia, the third Rakia, the Shekhinah continues to recede. The Shekhinah meaning the revealed divine consciousness and existence, until Avram Avinu, what does it say? Bo Avram v'hischil lahoyer. He began to bring back the light. Until Moshe brought it back down in the Deir Hashvi from Avram, the Shekhinah b'telamata v'osel migdash v'shachanti b'seicham. But permanently, we will do it when Mashiach comes. So now, what is the story after Adam and Chava? Then suddenly we're told that both of them, as a result of what they did, there's a punishment, a curse, if you wish. The truth is, it should be translated as cause and effect. Since Adam wandered away from his purpose of serving God, so God said, if that's the case, had you served me and you would have used your full day, la'avda l'shamra, to work and protect the Garden of Eden, as we learned at length, the role of Adam and Chava is to work the garden and make it produce even more fruit and produce than originally, then I would have taken care of all your physical needs. You wouldn't have to go develop a parnasa. But now that you didn't, so now you have to go work the field. The sweat of your brow, you'll have to eat bread, which means you're going to have to work in the field and refine, because the world you have now contaminated. So now you have to work the field and start finding parnasa and ultimately revealing godliness in a much more difficult way, where it would have been a lot easier had it not been for the Chet Eitz Hadas. What happens to Chava? Now, here's a critical point. It says, like he said, V'hu yimshal bach, vel ishach chikoscha, that now you will be dependent on him, that he will rule over you. What does that mean? That's a punishment, not a blessing. So Chassidus explains, and this is an unbelievable concept in the Chesed and Gevurah context, that generally speaking, Zoh, which is the Zocher, the male, is more mashpia, and Oir, and Chesed, Malchus, which is more makabel, and makabel doesn't mean passive. Makabel is a force of its own, but it's driven more by Gevurah. So Ma and Ban of Chesed and Gevurah, like he says here, is Ish v'Isha. Had there not been a Chet Eitz Hadas, then Ish v'Isha, both of them have a connection directly to godliness. But now, in a world like ours, what happens in a world where there's severities? Who's the one that can be hurt most? A woman. A woman can be far more hurt and violated than a man, because a man has more strength to protect himself. I'm talking about even sexually. So really originates because Malchus is a more gentler entity. But gentleness and the feminine energy in this world is far more susceptible to being hurt than masculine energy. Because masculine energy is aggressive energy, which has its own problems. So the Eibishter says that in this world where a woman is vulnerable, Hu Yimshal Bar, the Chesed will protect the Gevurah. The Chesed will sweeten the Gevurah until the day will come when Mashiach comes and the Keva to save of Gavur, that the woman will rise to her true prominence, and Gevurah of Malchus will connect to the Helam Ha'atzmi of Elikus. But right now, this world is not controlled by Elikus. It's controlled by Gevurahs, and Gevurahs kashis very often, by hostility. People can hurt each other and do hurt each other. So we have Chesed in a sense that's meant to protect. Now, of course, the aggression of the male could also be criminal, as we see. People can become warriors and violent and violate, but that's the goal, that a man has to sublimate his chesed as well. The gevurah that he has within his aggression, he also needs to sublimate. So this is a longer discussion. If you want more on this, I actually wrote about it in the Torah Meaning for Life. The chapter on women and men talks about this, not in the language of mam ban, but the general ideas of what I just described. So the point is that today we need chesed to sweeten the gevurah. And then we can come back to what he says here, that in that itself, there are two levels. There's chesed neutralizing the gevurah. We're talking about the negative part of it, like overriding it. Like we said, enough sweet waters will neutralize and nullify the bitter waters, but the bitter waters have not been fundamentally changed. Then there's a next level that chesed comes, also chesed, and not just through its abundance, but its very quality of being a Gili Ein Sof of godliness, has the power to reveal and also allow Gevurah to be transformed, not just diluted or neutralized or nullified, but to be transformed, like he says. That's the second level. But then la'asad lave, this is all today when Gevurah needs chesed to protect it and to sublimate it and to sweeten it. And la'asad lave, once that aveda will be finished, then something new will happen. We'll go back to a state where, after all the work of these thousands of years of sweetening, refining, neutralizing, and even transforming Gevurah, we'll come to a point where we can now retrace Gevurah's connection to its original root in the Tzimtzum Arishin and the Helam Ha'atzmi of Elokus, and seeing Heineng Gevurah. Gevurah is actually not just a power of God, it's even more powerful than the power of revelation. Because revelation only reveals the God that comes in structure and has an identity and a tziyur. And the Helam Ha'atzmi of Gevurah, that Gevurah touches, reaches the divine that's higher than tziyur and higher than structure. And that loss of love will be a new reality, a new paradigm, where Gevurah itself will be able to connect, as we shall learn much more in detail as we go along. So I wanted to give, I know it's been a long review here, but I wanted to give this background because to really understand this well, it's critical to understand how the whole process begins, where we're at, and where we're headed. So that's my explanation. I hope that was helpful. And I think it'll put into context a lot of things here, much more clarity. If anybody wants to ask anything, please do.
Beautiful. But we still didn't explain, and I think that you agree.
We didn't explain the next 30 pages. That's what you want to point out? Yes, that's correct.
That how is the Gevurah loss in Lavoi? How will that be?
Well, first of all, I did explain. I said it's going to be connected to the Helam Ha'atzmi where it originated from. However, the Rebbe Rashab already said this earlier, and he explained it actually in quite a few pages, just for the record. How? He's going to explain it. He's going to explain. Well, we learned it inside. I could tell you the pages. You can go back and read it. The whole issue of Kalim and Eir and the Reshimu. He spoke about this relatively at length. I only will say is that he's going to speak about a lot more about it in the next 25 pages. So we're going to get a lot more. But there is already been plenty. A lot of what I just said comes from what he said earlier. I just put it into a context here.
Okay, very beautiful. You could
There's definite number 3 that you said yesterday, and we still use the terms chesed and gevurah at that point when they're at that level. I mean, because it seems
he says the words "Ma'ilus hagvurah lachsadim la'asid." Yeah, because there's still two tracks. They're two godly powers.
The Eibishter did not want to make.
Anyway, listen. If you really want to fully understand it, I would suggest going back where he starts talking about this whole topic back a while back with transformation, where he talks about Kalim. And then we're still going to continue learning. So this is not the end of the discussion. There's plenty more to come. I just wanted to give some context, not explaining everything as much as that we learned, I've explained, and there'll be more.
Yeah,
what were you saying?
Very powerful. I said you could ask in the beginning when they needed Kiviyachol the Gevurah, why didn't he make a stop that the Gevurah should be used only?
That would be like, why did he give us free will?
Okay, that's a deal of Tachtenim.
Exactly, because there's if he wants a dira b'tachtenim, he can't control. The fact is, concealment will create tachtenim, and tachtenim, like the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Lamed Vav, ultimately evolves to the point of Haniva Avsiate. Kav Yochel, the Eibishter, is not going to stop that because that's what he wants. He wants a tachtenim that will recognize God, not to go the other way. And that's the story of history. You're asking the question, why did God allow people to sin? Why God allowed people to be, because he wants them to be independent, and there's no way around that.
Right.
One more thing, I want to just ask you, when you just gave that wonderful explanation and review, did you like make notes to do this? Was this a stream of consciousness? How I can't even imagine how somebody can do something like that.
First of all, I've been learning Chassidus quite a while in my life, and I have, to my best of my ability, tried to internalize it. And it didn't begin by learning this page in these pages in Ayin Beis. So when you learn enough Maimorim, you start getting a sense of this picture that I just described. What I summed up is really, I would say, years and years of struggling with these issues and learning different Maimorim and getting a picture of what is going on. And then, so when you learn it inside here, you see the deeper, the richer texture, so to speak, and context of what the Rebbe Rashab is saying. So it's informed by what I've learned. I mean, I'm sure that things I said now you've heard or learned somewhere. Maybe you haven't put together all the pieces. So there's no one mimer that I can tell you. I mean, the mimer I mentioned, Al Kain Yemru HaMoishlim, is a very fundamental mimer where he talks a little about how from Helam of godliness comes the darkness that I described, and there's the Maimer Basilagani Tovshin Lamed Aleph where the Rebbe speaks about it as well. And of course, Tanya, chapter 36, even though it's not a long chapter, if you read it closely now, go back to it, and you'll see what I said here is all there. It's just very concise. Now, he doesn't speak about Chesed and Gevurah, that's correct. But I'm talking also when you see the words like Zeh Yisod Kol HaTeirah, this is the foundation of all of Teirah. You know, it begs explanation. Where do you see that? And then you realize what the Rebbe Rashab is essentially saying, that this is the purpose of all of existence, is to sweeten or to illuminate the darkness or to sweeten the bitterness. Anyway, I can't really explain how flows of consciousness, stream of consciousness works, but I could say that it's doable. I mean, but it's work. It doesn't come easy. I didn't have an epiphany one day. It's combination of many, many things. Remember also, I spent over 15 years writing Farbrengens, where the Rebbe's Farbrengens were filled with these ideas. And you have to very much internalize it when you write. I didn't just write like a parakeet. I had to like digest it and then put it on paper and remember it. So in a lot of absorbing and a lot of listening, all this, it ultimately shapes your way of thinking. Because to me, this is even more than this. This shapes everything I do and everything I think, or when I advise people or ask me questions, it's all shaped by these concepts. That's also helps you understand not to get distracted by the Helam. Even the darkest of dark ultimately can be traced somewhere. That doesn't make it less painful. It just means, however, it gives it some semblance of not control, but at least you understand that the darkest of dark originated somewhere, and then what do you do about it? Anyway, that's my best response I can give. I don't,
Thank you.
Okay. So, since I assume no one else wants to ask anything, why don't we just continue? So in the next paragraph, the Rebbe Rashab is going to elaborate some more on these two types of sweetening, the two. The third he's going to get back to later. though he already mentioned it, but he's not yet elaborating on it. So what he says now is this: V'nimtza. V'nimtza means, and from this we derive, or we take. This is the takeaway. V'nimtza. We find now, after what we've discussed, sheyesh shnei minei hamtoka, that there are two types of sweetening. Ha'echad, hu hamtokas ha'gevurah al yedei ribui hachsadim, the sweetening of the Gevurah through an abundance of kindness and love, hamizgabrim aleim, that overpower them, that dominate over them. Shezeu rak habitl v'chlishus the b'chinas ha'gevurah. That only causes a nullification and a weakness in the level of Gevurah. And he's going to repeat some things we already said, but I guess the Rebbe Rashab wants to sum it up, and he's going to add some points. What we're going to read here has some redundancy, but doesn't hurt. From my point of view, the more the Rebbe repeats himself, the better it is, because it just confirms and helps understand certain things. So don't mind that he's going to do that, and he's going to add some nuances. So it says, mad. He's referring back to what he said before, and again, he's connecting it to different themes throughout Chassidus. So remember, he said before, Hamshachas mad. He called that Gevurah was the same ma. Where was it? Actually, there he said ma and ban, but mad and ma and mad and man. He also used, I believe, in the previous page, if I recall, halos man. Yeah, if you look at the bottom of the end of the paragraph on page 1317, he said. Now remember, mad is like a susa de la'ela, that is the mayan tchurin. It literally means the masculine waters. Man is mayan nukvin, the feminine waters. But don't think of it in the physical sense. Think of it conceptually. Is the eir hamashpia and is the eir hamakabel. And halos man refers to the aveda from below. Our effort, we initiate. Hamshachas mad is the hamshacha from above. So in this context, hamshachas mad is like chesed, and halos man is like gvura. So he says, ukamoy hamshachas mad. Remember we said al ishach chukoshka. That's where he said the feminine. That's why I mentioned about adam and chava. So he says, so kamoy hamshachas mad shemamtik laharotze. So the man from below malchus and the gvuras are thirsty and yearning and longing to connect because they're lacking. Less lamagal klum. There's a concealment. So the hamshachas mad sweetens and quenches laharotze, the halos man, to the yearning and the longing, to the calling from below. So when we call below, there's a response from above, essentially. Ukamoi is basmas nukva. And he goes back to what he explained. He used that expression. This is clearly from Zoyar. The last line of the paragraph on page 1317 is basmas nukva.
The opposite. No, he's saying the opposite. Hamshachas mad. This is milmailo lemato.
That's what I just said.
This v'huyim shel boch. It's not really shech shukosech. This is.
Listen. Let me explain it my way. If you have a disagreement,
I think you said it.
Trust me, I know what I'm saying. Go back and read the previous paragraph. You'll see what I'm saying. So there's halos man, which is a thirst that comes from below. That is el ishach. That's el ishach shikoscha. They said that clearly on the page I'm referring to. Okay. And then there's the response. Hamshachas mad is quenching and satisfying or responding to that thirst, to that yearning, by his basmas, was from the word ipsume, which is like quenching or intoxicating. Malchus, nukva, that the nukva gets quenched or gets sated. V'ovid neichalo, he said on the end of the expression on the previous page. He's referring to the same expressions he's used. So this is the chesed is being sweetening the gevurah. The gevurah is yearning and longing. So it's a form of gevurah reaching upward in need, so to speak. And chesed, hamshachas mad, is responding to that. But this is not transforming Gevurah or Malchus. This is Amizgabrim. I'm talking Gevurah. Shezeu lefisha levad. This Hamshach is only lefisha. This is only temporary. Shari eretz leisova mayim. Because the earth continues to be parched and does not get sated by the water. It's like when it's raining and you water the earth and the ground, it doesn't last. It will need to be watered again. And eretz, for the record, is malchus and also comes from the word rotze. That's why it's called. Lama nikra shma eretz, the Medrash says, because the kene, I think is the expression. Anyway, it comes from the word rotze, yearning. So just like the eretz does not get quenched, it does not get sated by the water, so it's only temporary, this hamshach. It has not transformed the gvuras or the malchus, the gvuras of malchus, to being sated. It needs constantly to receive more. That's the best proof that it's not transformed, that it's only what he said. It only weakened the thirst, so to speak. It satisfied for a while. May all those that are thirsty go toward water. The mayim the mamtik. What is that referring to? Because when you're thirsty, you're not. If you had the water, you wouldn't be thirsty. So what is it referring to? The mayim the teira, the water of teira. Teira is called a mayim el teira. Teira is compared to water. Mamtik, it sweetens. Umerave, and it quenches the thirst that's created when the person davens, which is Allah's man, and you're davening and reaching to God and you're seeking and longing to be connected. So Teira is like the mayim that responds and is mamtik and quenches that thirst. But nevertheless, it's not permanent. So even when you learn before davening or whenever, still the thirst returns, and it comes to a point of rotze, of yearning afterwards during davening, even though you had learned Teira before. So Teira, like watering the fields or the earth, it definitely waters, but it doesn't transform permanently. It continues to need it. But adarabba, and on the contrary, not does it return to the same thirst. It comes to even greater thirst, because once you've learned Teira and gotten a taste of the water, a person who's tasted the water gets more thirsty than someone who's not tasted it. Like it says elsewhere, be'inyan rotze v'shuv. The concept of rotze and shuv. Rotze is the yearning. Shuv is it's like the tension and resolution. The yearning and the return and the resolution and the resolving of it, or the thirst and the quenching of the thirst. Sharotze mevi shuv. That the rotze, the yearning and the longing, generates the shuv, the response. Vashuv mevi sarotze. And the shuv also brings on the thirst, because once you taste, then you want more. So it also leads to rotze. So shuv, rotze leads to shuv, and shuv leads to rotze. It's like the heartbeat is also explained, contraction, expansion. Ukamoy kain, I'm just going to read till Ayin Beis. Ukamoy kain hu b'tevara. And similarly, it's also when you talk about good and evil or right and wrong, Sharam is batul mepnei hatev, that when the good dominates, so the ra gets nullified in the presence, in the face of the good, like darkness that gets dispelled in the face of light. Like the dominance. And again, this piece about mad, he added some things. Now he's going back to ideas he said in the last few pages, like the dominance of goodness of the divine soul, the nefesh alikis. In the face of that, the negativity and the selfishness and the ra of the animal soul becomes nullified. Its power, its force, its strength gets weakened. like we learned before, to the point that it also brings the Nefesh Abamis to a form of loving God. It's not a transformation, but at this point, the Nefesh Elikis had enough impact on the animal soul that it should come to Ava. The Kol Zeh, all of this, is the weakening and the nullification or the neutralization of the animal soul. Not that you have fundamentally in its very personality eliminated it. Ukanal, like it was explained earlier. So, as I said, he's a nimtze, he's summing up the two ways, and then comes the second wave of Habeis. I'm going to stop here by the Habeis, and the Beis is going to be when it does transform the Etzem Husay, the very personality. So, in a way, this is the Beinani to some extent, because it's not fundamentally changing the animal soul, but it's controlling it and taming it and even neutralizing it, at least for a time being, for a time period. But then he's going to now talk about the second Eifen, and he's going to continue this discussion as he moves this to the third. So the Rebbe Rashab is elaborating more. But I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions, if there are any. So just to give you the lay of the land, he's going to go back to the second Eifen. Yeah, he's going to dissect a lot more of these two methods, these two Eifanim, until he really goes back to the third. I think the third really begins on page 1325. So we're at 1318. So another 7 pages, because there he says, Omnam yesh Eifen gimel bam tokas hagvuras. That's where he really, but I think he's going to refer to it, but he's going to really, the next 7 pages is going to be discussion of these two and how Chesed does this job. Remember, this has been the work we've been doing for thousands of years, from after Chet Eitz Hadas until Mashiach comes. And then he's going to talk about the Eifen HaGimel, and we of course have a Me'ein Zeh, he said clearly, a taste of it today as well, but in full glory, it's going to shine when after in La'asid Lavi. That's on page 1325. And that will go for also quite a few pages. We'll get to that. Right now, we're far from there. Plenty to go. $1345, which is another 20 pages after that, is when the Rebbe Rashab comes back and finally concludes the topic of darkness being transformed to light. So if you want the lay of the land, that's where we are right now. 1318 to 1325 will be the 2. 1325 to 1345 will be the third Eifen. And then he's going to come back and tie it all together with its tzaddikim and Baalei Tshuva, and ultimately how darkness is transformed. And then he's going to conclude the parentheses of the Magid, which is all in the Mamat Lamaila. Then he's going to go back to Torah on page 1350, if you really want to have the whole landscape. But we'll go over that many, many times until we get there. So
after that, he did not write anymore. But
yes, he did. Oh, yeah, no, that's not correct. After that, he writes another 100 pages.
Wow.
Yeah. On page 1350, he finishes the parentheses. Then he goes all the way. The Hemshire goes all the way to 1400, and I believe 1477. So from 1350 to 1477, there's another 120 pages, 127 pages, where he talks about Torah. We'll get there. We're not there yet. We're far from there.
That
Right
was
now, at 13.
the formal conclusion of Ayin Beis, or it didn't happen.
He didn't. It says that it's apparent that he did not conclude it, because there are also questions and themes that he mentions that he said he'll explain and he doesn't explain. However, I can't say right now, and I'm looking forward to be able to say, once we finish, I think we'll be able to at least surmise how much more would there have been. It all depends how many threads are not tied together. I think a lot will be connected, but there'll probably be a few things that he did not, but it could be a few pages more that he would have written, or maybe another 100 pages for all we know. So I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but I think once you finish, you could start seeing what did he leave? Because the Rebbe Rashab, as you see, Ayin Beis, like a puzzle. So you could see things that he starts 100 pages, like Ein Eid. He's going to finish the topic of Ein Eid. And the question is, what is left that he hasn't covered? So again, the Rebbe Rashab, I'm sure, could have written 1,000 more pages. But I'm talking, at least in our seichel, I think we'll be able to figure out to some extent what remains still, like was not really finished up. But he asks enough questions for us to be able to figure that. But we're not there yet. That's going to be in a few years, the way we're going.
We see that the Rebbe Rashab, after that, it was still until Tafresh Pei. Ayin Tes is a whole world. It's bigger than.
Yeah, I'm talking about Ayin Beis. Ayin Beis, he wrote definitely till middle of Ayin Ches, because he refers to Maimorim in Ayin Ches later. So we know at least it went till Ayin Ches. Maybe that's as far as we know, because he actually cites Maimorim from the year Tafresh Ayin Ches, which is 2 years after he left Lubavitch, where volume 2 ends, Vayera Ayin Vov. So we know that for 2 years for sure that he's working. He may have worked all the way till Tafresh Pei and Ayin Beis. We don't know.
He's in Rostov now, and he left Lubavitch. He's ready to go.
Yeah, now is Rostov. Yeah, once he left Lubavitch in 1915, basically October 5th, 1915, or November 1915. Then he moved to Rostov, and most likely this was written there, unless he wrote it earlier, which is also possible. But clearly he refers to Ayin Ches, so most likely all written, or a lot of it in Rostov. That's what's most likely the case.
So
Okay, so
that after he left Lubavitch, he did not continue with Ayin Beis, or we see
he continued writing it.
Maimorim.
He didn't deliver it. He continued writing it. He just didn't say it.
Oh wow! All of this after Lubavitch, he did not say.
No.
Ayin Tes, no.
No. Vayera Ayin Vov is the last mimer that he actually delivered. It was the last mimer he delivered in Lubavitch.
In Rostov, he did not deliver Maimorim.
He did, but not part of Hemshech Ayin Beis. It's its own sefer Maimorim. Tafresh Ayin Vov, Ayin Zayin, Ayin Ches, Ayin Tes, and Tafresh Pei.
So formally, after Lubavitch, it's not considered the Hemshech Ayin Beis.
It didn't say that. It is considered Hemshech Ayin Beis. He just didn't deliver it. He wrote it. He calls it clearly. It's called Hemshech Ayin Beis. It's part of the Rebbe Rashab's Hemshech. There's writing, there's delivery. Not every mimer that was written was delivered b'rabim. There are a lot of mimerim. It says loy nemar. So mimerim, like from the Friedrich Rebbe, you have mimerim that the Friedrich Rebbe wrote, and it says loy nemar. He didn't say it, but he wrote it, and he has a date on it even.
So the Maimorim delivered in Rostov. What makes us to feel that this is not connected to Hemshech Ayin Beis?
Because Hemshech Ayin Beis is right here. The Rebbe Rashab. That makes us feel. The Rebbe Rashab calls this Hemshech Ayin Beis, and those were just single Maimorim that he said every Shabbos. Even when he's delivered Hemshech Ayin Beis, there are Maimorim that he said that were not part of the Hemshech.
Oh. So he said,
Rebbe Rashab would say this is part of the Hemshech or not. He determined, not us. When a Maimer says Yesh lahagdim mashin is bar le'il, you know he's continuing. When a Maimer doesn't say that, and you just there's Maimorim in Tafresh Ayin Beis, in Gimel, Ayin Daled. There's a Sefer Maimorim called Ayin Beis, Ayin Vov. These are Maimorim that are not part of the Hemshech that the Rebbe Rashab said during that period of time. In Samach Vov, you also have that. You have Maimorim that are not part of the Hemshech that the Rebbe Rashab said. And I mean, he doesn't make any connection between them. A Hemshech is very clear. Every mimer flows from the previous one in the theme. The single maimorim are very apparent. Okay, we'll stop here, bottom of page 1318, after Eifana Aleph.